I'm glad to be with you, brothers. We're going to be in Joshua 4 in a few minutes. If you want to get your Bibles and get them open there. It's an honor for me to be with you. I've known of this congregation for a long time. Much like the church in Thessalonica, your reputation goes far and wide. You are known for your passionate worship. You are known for your sincere stance for the truth and the things that are right. And as one who has been benefited and blessed by your great example, it's good to be with you and to see this face to face. Thank you to your good shepherds for the opportunity to be with you. And thank you to my brother David for opening the door and allowing me to be here with you. And I'm glad to see our young brothers. I'm glad that you're here. I had one of our shepherds back home. They wanted to make a video for some advertisement, some evangelistic opportunity, and they said, we wanted someone who's not too young and not too old, and so we chose you. I said, I don't know what that means. There's a lot we're going to talk about this weekend that applies to every single person that is here, and some who aren't. It's going to apply, as David said, in concepts of leadership, but in a large sense, a lot of just what we're going to talk about has to do with our relationship one with another and how that translates in the home and in the church. We're looking at different generations this weekend and the conflicts and the difficulties that are facing our generations around us today. Here's the irony I'll share with you before we get into our study, and I'll kind of lay the groundwork for where we're going to go. This is the third time I've been asked to speak on this subject, and it's not that I've advertised that I can talk about it. There are a lot of churches wanting to talk about this. There are a lot of congregations that are facing either issues or are seeing some of the issues on the horizon and wanting to say something about it before it gets out of hand. And I'm not suggesting that's what this is. I just believe that the choosing of this subject for this weekend is a way of allowing us to talk about things that are current to our culture and current to God's people wherever we are. This is going on, especially back home in Dallas. This is something we talk about a lot, about the difference in our generations and how it is we live with one another, react with one another, and plan for the legacy of our faith wherever it is that we are. So I'm hoping the things we talk about will be an encouragement. I want to begin with, for our first lesson, I want to set the groundwork. Our second lesson, I have some workshop things I want to share with you and explore together with you, and I have some things I want to get your input on. And I'll have a little bit in this first lesson, but I really want to set the stage and help you see why I chose this direction and where it is we're going to be heading for the entirety of the next few lessons. Typically, when you look at the generational breakdowns within any given congregation, much like your church here at Kleinwood, on any given Sunday, on any given service, you're going to have this sort of representation, demographic among you. There are just a few left of our greatest generations among us. Those would be my grandfather's generations. They are in their 90s at this point. Many of them were the ones who fought in the war, experienced a completely different world than the one that we are in now. Behind them, you got to wave your pictures, is our silent generation, 1925 to 1945. Our baby boomers, 1946 to 1964. That's my father's generation. Generation X is our 1965 to 1980. Millennials are the 1981 to 1996. Generation Z is the 1997 to 2012. And then they're calling them the Alphas. We're going to change that if we have anything to say about it. But my children's generations is 2013 to 2024. Now, none of that's hard and fast. It's just a way of breaking down the different generations that exist. Now, obviously, if you look at the years represented on the screen, there's just so much different between what each generation has experienced, the worlds that they were raised in, and then because of that, the way that they think and their priorities, the way that they handle difficulties, the way that they interact with one another, the technology they were born in. And so, for instance, I don't know if you can read that or not, but one breakdown of the different generations and the way that they think and their outlook on different areas of life just shows the difference of boomers' optimism with Gen X skepticism and millennials maybe overconfidence, and then Generation Z's protective, and how that applies to a workplace and their view of money and their view of leadership and their kind of work-life relationship and how they use certain media today. And the reality is, while we're talking about all of this, my kids' generation isn't going to appear on the screen because we haven't figured them out yet. We're still trying to figure out what is their life going to be like. And we'll talk about why in a little bit. Or you think about what each generation has experienced in terms of some of the major milestones within the generation. You know, the silent generation faced things such as the tail end of the Second World War and the Great Depression. The boomers went through Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement and the presidential assassination and the space exploration. And Generation Z had great things going on overseas, but then even here, when you had the AIDS outbreak and the Challenger disaster, the millennials, I think for us, 9/11 is probably the pinnacle of what it is that we will remember of what took place. And Columbine has shaped the way that we have looked at so much of our relationships in our schools. Generation Z, maybe ISIS, Sandy Hook, some things that were decided within legislation like the marriage equality. You just kind of look about what each generation has experienced and how each of those moments and milestones played a part in the shaping and defining of how we look and see and react towards certain things that take place around us. It's just fascinating. If you're a student of culture, this is an interesting study. Why is it the way that why are we the way that we are, and what contributed to those ways of thinking? Well, this is where I want us to get. We're not really just going to focus on generations in general. I want us to get here. What is the difference among our generations relating to the spiritual things, the things that matter the most? I came across a piece not long ago that was written by D.A. Carson that talked about the division existing among God's people from different generations. I'm not going to read all of it. I just want you to get the snippet. Some of it I'll have on the screen, and some of it I'll lead into. I just want you to listen real close. This is what Carson wrote was existing. It happened years ago, and then he said actually not long ago, he examined the same different people in the same different demographics and saw the same gap and widening division that was taking place. So here's what he says. 5 years after the Berlin Wall came down, I had the privilege of speaking at a conference for pastors in one of those formerly Eastern Bloc countries. They were clearly divided into two groups. The older group, say 40 or 45 and up, had served their small congregations under the former communist government. Few of them had been allowed to pursue any deeper education, let alone formal theological training. Most of them had served in considerable poverty, learning to trust God for the food that they and their families needed to survive. Some of them had been incarcerated for the sake of the gospel, and all of them had been harassed. The men in the younger group, those who were under 40, without exception, were university graduates. Several of them had pursued formal theological education. 2 or 3 were beginning their doctorates. They were interested in ideas and the rapidly evolving cultural developments taking place in their country now that their media was a good deal freer. But here's one thing he said. I don't know if you can read this with me. That the older group viewed the younger men as untested, ignorant of the lessons learned by the suffering, far too cerebral, dizzying, scattered, and ill-focused, cocky, impatient, and even arrogant. The younger group viewed the older men as, at best, out of date. They had slipped past their sell-by date as much as had the communist regimes. They were ill-trained, defined too narrowly by yesterday's conflicts, unable to evangelize the new generation, vainly clutching to power, consumed rather more by tradition than by truth. He would have went on to write, and he says, more recently, right, that took place at the end of the Berlin Wall conflict, and he says, more recently I spoke at a denominational meeting of ministers in a Western country, so this took place in the last 5 years. He says, again, there was a generational breakdown, but this time it was cast somewhat differently. The older men had, during their decades of ministry, combated the old-fashioned liberalism that had threatened their denomination in their youth. Many of them had been converted out of rough backgrounds and subsequently built strong fences around their churches to keep out alcohol and the sleaze of every sort. Most of their congregations were aging, along with their ministers, and only a handful of them were growing. They loved the older hymns and the older patterns of worship. The younger men, dressed in jeans, they loved corporate worship where the music was at least 95 decibels loud. They were interested in evangelism. They loved to talk to those who were disaffected, the homosexuals, the self-proclaimed atheists, the mystically oriented spiritual artists. Again, This younger group thought the older men were out of date, too defensive, unable to communicate to the people under 25 without sounding stuffy, and even condescending, much too linear and boring in their thinking, and largely unable to communicate in the digital world except by emails, already largely dismissed as belonging to the age of dinosaurs, mere traditionalists. The older group thought the younger men were brash, disrespectful, far too enamored with what's in, and far too ignorant of a well-integrated theology, frantic but not deep, energetic but not wise, and more than a little cocky. And here's what I realize. This is one man's take, one man's observation, and it's painted with a broad brush. So take it as it is. But I don't think it's too much of a stretch to state that there certainly is a gap. That was a phrase from the 60s, a generational gap, a division that has taken place among the generations. If you think of our older ones, our silent generations, all the way down to our Gen Zs, that there's a difference in the way that they live and think, and sometimes that results in a growing distance in terms of closeness. So I ask you, why do you think that is? Not what, but why. What has contributed among God's men, among God's people, that would cause such kind of a division in the generations? Yeah, David.
I just personally believe that either groups, all these groups, don't know too much what it is really to be connected with the Christ mind of grace and forgiveness.
That's right.
Upbuilding that spirit of upbuilding each other.
That's right.
Transcend together.
That's right. And so it's not just,
Relationship, in other words.
yeah, sometimes we kind of pit it that way, that maybe a younger generation is more grace-minded than an older one, and yet the way that they go about expressing that grace mind doesn't have any grace to it. And so neither one really has an understanding of this fruit of the Spirit to build these close relationships. That's good. What else? Yeah, Matt.
I think probably in general there's a lack of understanding and appreciation of the different generations, what's important to them, and
Yeah.
how you communicate with them.
So the question to that, of a lack of understanding, is it a lack of interest? One generation just doesn't have the interest to get to know the other? Is it just a lack of effort? What is it that has contributed to the fact that these generations exist with certain mindsets and certain ways of looking at the Lord and the world, and they're not really taking the steps to get to know one another, to sympathize with each other? Yes, sir.
I think it's also, as you get older, your values change. So when you're younger, you have a certain perception of how things should be and how things need to work. And when you get older, you realize certain things have to go a certain way in order for it to work.
I was a lot smarter in my 20s than I am now, I'll tell you that. I knew everything about marriage and parenting before I got married and had kids. Yeah.
That's what the relationship needs to be adequate communication. I think many times the younger groups, the older groups, the older group,
That's right.
they don't commingle and talk to one another. If they spend no time together, they don't understand each other.
And that makes sense, right? Because when you look at it, especially with more community kind of style churches, the idea is build life groups. And so surround yourself with the people of where you are. And in theory, that sounds right? You want to be able to have people where you are, to share in life and what's going on with your kids and your marriages. But the problem is, if that's the only people we spend time with, and we're never really reaching up or down regarding where we are, then those kind of relationships and conversations aren't going to happen. That's great, brother. Good. Yeah, Brother Joseph.
I think it's something to do with Bible knowledge,
Yes.
Bible awareness,
Yes.
and Bible application.
Absolutely right. It's obvious that when you look at those quotes from before, all that is lacking. Had nothing to do with truth. There was no substance to the division in which they saw one from another. Let me give you two things that I saw here that I think have contributed to this. Think this through for a moment. Think of the rate of cultural change that has taken place. Think about my father was born in 1957, and so he is of the boomer generation and the world in which he grew up in. And then you think about his grandchildren, and so my children. Things have progressed. I'll show a little chart. Things have progressed so rapidly, so quickly. It's so difficult for children of today's generation, those alphas, to even imagine a world that had a phone that connected with a cord, or typing on a typewriter, or things that were black and white, or things that didn't exist. It's almost unfathomable for them to imagine that kind of a world, and thus be able to empathize and sympathize with them. But from the other side of things, and I hear this all the time from my father, is that it's almost too hard to keep up with the changes. And so if I want to interact with the teenagers of today, well, they're always on the move, and it's always changing, and we're always adding new ways of talking and listening and connecting with one another. So both generations have further divided from one another just because of how fast we've progressed. I mean, think of it, the last decade, how much we have progressed with the technology and the way that we think and interact with the world. I think the other contributor to this, if we were just honest about it, is that this has always existed, all the way back when the son of Solomon had a choice, and when Rehoboam was asking for wisdom and leading the nation. We'll pull it up here in a moment in our text. He had wise men who came to him and offered him wise advice, but he rejected it for the voice of those who were of his peers. Think back to our country, the 1960s, right? The mantra of the 1960s is to reject all set, established, authoritarian voices and to allow the voice of the youth to be the voice of wisdom. Here's why I say that. Some of you won't know this name. It's not going to mean a thing, and it doesn't matter. I'm just going to give you the quote. Ed Harrell wrote a book years ago. The book was about a man named Homer Haley. And in the book, what he talked about was a division that took place in the churches of Christ in the 50s and 60s. But I want you to notice something he said. It doesn't matter if you know those names or not. Just look at the quote. He said, many in the younger generations, well-educated and driven by the social agenda of that period, found the traditional concerns of the 20th century churches of Christ inadequate and irrelevant to the world in which they lived. Sounds a lot like the quotes we were just reading. He says, as a result, they seriously questioned almost every aspect of their tradition. One of the forces at work in the churches of Christ in the 60s, as in American society in general, was, notice, a generational crisis that isolated young people from the thinking of their elders. What made that division so prevalent during the 50s and 60s where churches split and divided? Well, one of the contributing factors was the fact in our culture, young people were encouraged to not listen to the voices of those who were older. It was in the spirit of that time, and it's no different today. I mean, it does not take long, and you do a little polling of what today's mindset is. And among young people, really among Americans in general, but it's certainly strong in young people, there's never been a time when there's lower trust in the set institutional mindsets, whether it's bosses in work or the government, or some will even take it back to the churches. There's never been a time of greater distrust in Americans and in American youth towards set established authority than what we have today. It has always been around. That's why this matters. There was a bulletin that went out years ago called Plain Talk, and one of the writers in that, Dan Shipley, made this observation. He says, whatever happens in the country ends up making its way into our congregations. That's why that matters. Because if this is the mindset of what's going on with our neighbors and our citizens, then you had better believe that there's going to be some in the pews, and this is the way they're thinking. Like, why trust our elders? They're of a different generation. They're out of touch. They don't know how to communicate with me. They don't know social media. They don't know what my needs are. And so why listen to them when they don't know me? They're not listening to me. If it's happening in the nation, you had better believe this is why it's happening in some of our churches today. That's why this subject matters. And I'll tell you this, as much as we have more to cover, we're not going to get through it all in 4 lessons. This is a conversation starter, or maybe just a conversation continuer. I guarantee some of your shepherds have already talked about this, but this is something that we have to keep talking about. As that divide keeps going on, and that younger generation and technology takes off, what are we going to do, older brothers, to not keep that gap from going further and further away? Let me just give a couple of scriptures here. God's plan through Scripture has always been both for His people as a whole and for His people individually to be a people who grow because of greater generational blessings, greater generational involvement. I ask you to open your Bibles to Joshua chapter 4. Joshua 4, God gives his people the commandment to cross over the Jordan River. And after they crossed the Jordan River, the children of Israel were commanded to set up 12 stones from the parted path of the Jordan River as this memorial. Verse 5 of our context, Joshua 4, verse 5. It says, Joshua said to them, cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on the shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. Let this be a sign among you, so that when your children ask later, saying, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall say to them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. He says the same thing down in verse 21, that to the sons of Israel, he said, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? You shall inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed. That all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. You notice God's response wasn't just send them to me. Okay? Send them to me, I'll give them the answer, I'll give them the truth. The answer was, you, the older generation, you, the fathers and the grandfathers, are responsible for teaching the next generation about who I am and what I have done. That's at the heart of Deuteronomy 6. That there's going to be a generation that's going to teach diligently their children the ways of the Lord, to talk of his word, talk of them when you sit in the house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down, when you rise up. It is the responsibility of an older generation to the younger. Same thing as Psalm 78 in verse 5, that he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children, that they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. When we come to the New Testament, we think about 2 Timothy 2:2, where Paul says, and the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, these entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. I'm teaching you so that you'll teach others who will take this truth and they'll teach others, and we will have this continual progression, chain of teaching the truth one generation by another. Same thing in Titus 2, the responsibility of older women and older men to those who were younger underneath them, of what they were to teach and what they were to pass along. In fact, we might just kind of put it on the board. Would there be a Joshua who was ready to lead if Moses had not taken the time to prepare him? Would Elisha have been Elisha had Elijah not taken the time to show him, to lead him, to talk to him about what it meant to be a prophet of the Lord? Why did Jesus take 3 years? Why 3 years with the apostles? As soon as he announced he could have gone to Jerusalem on his time when he wanted to, but he took the time and the teaching and the opportunity. We'll talk through what he did tomorrow with his apostles, but it's an example, preparing men for the role of service. Paul chose out of all men. I'll give my older brothers the teasers and let you think about this tonight before we get to tomorrow. When Paul came in Acts 16 to Derbe and Lystra, it's a hard path he had. No churches existed. He is starting them one by one. The gospel is new. This is precious and vulnerable. And when Paul comes to Derbe and Lystra, he doesn't choose an older, seasoned man to go with him. He chooses a young man. Why? Why? That why is really important. Why did he choose Timothy? Why a young man? What are we supposed to be learning from this? All right, brothers, here's the question for you. Let's say it happens. Let's say that in our congregations, in our homes and our families, that it does happen. A generational gap, division takes place. So what? What's the consequence of this? What are we looking at? If this really takes place, if there's a division between our generations that exist among us in our congregations, what's the risk of that? What's the consequence that could possibly happen? Give me one.
Just like in Judges, another generation came up that did not know God.
So we're running a risk of having that repeat itself, where there's going to be a generation who doesn't know the Lord and thus doesn't walk with them. That's good. What else? Brother Joseph.
Our sons and daughters, our grandchildren may be involved with those who do not know God.
So
They may relinquish the things that they've been taught.
So how many generations then may be affected before that gets reversed? How many? How many lives? How many souls will be affected if it's not fixed? That's sobering. What else, brothers? What else is a consequence? What would happen if our generations just said, we're good. I don't need them. We're good on our own.
The shepherds become ineffective.
I mean, what's really the role of shepherds then? Shepherds become deacons. Shepherds start worrying more about light bulbs and carpets than they do about souls because the souls aren't listening to them. They're ineffective in their work. Good. Yeah, see?
Well, fewer people to choose those shepherds from.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. What's going to happen to our congregations? What's going to happen to the Lord's people? What's going to happen to this work if all of a sudden now we don't have them among us? Yeah.
It could take it right down to the family. It could impact separation or division within the family unit.
Absolutely so. Absolutely. I mean, that's a good question. We might get there a little bit tomorrow. How many here is at least a second generation Christian? Do we have any second generations among us? Second plus? Right? It's a question, isn't it? If that stops, right, how many generations until something gets back on track, if it ever does, within that family line, within that family name? It's good. All right, let me give you what I had on screen. One, you got a younger generation without wisdom. Yes, they can gain it. Yes, wisdom comes from God. Wisdom comes from God's word. I get all of that. I realize it. But Proverbs also teaches that wisdom comes from walking with the wise. If you want to be wise, you live and walk with those who are wise. And so imagine with me, I can, if I want to, say, I've got it. I don't need you. I don't need your advice. I'm going to do what I want to do. That is exactly what it was that Rehoboam chose to do. He had wisdom given to him, and he says, I'm good. I'm going to listen to my peers. So I can either choose to do it on my own. I'm not going to listen to those who have walked with the Lord, those who have proven themselves by His word, and I'm going to try and do it by myself. And maybe I'll get there. Maybe I'll reach a place of wisdom in time after work. I might not. It may not be what's really wise, or there might be a lifetime of mistakes leading up to it before I actually eventually get there. That's one of our challenges, brothers. Throughout this weekend, I'm going to put myself in everyone's category. So if I say us, just go with me in the moment. For those who are younger, though, that's our struggle. Let's be honest with it. Especially millennials. One of our greatest challenges is we choose terrible mentors, terrible people to listen to. Instead of looking at those who are older and wiser with the Lord, sometimes we choose ourselves as our source of wisdom, listen to our own hearts and our own wisdom. Sometimes we grab on to the main theologians of the day because they sound really impressive. And like King Ahaziah, we choose counselors for our own undoing. People who lead us in certain ways of thinking and acting and believing. And then we look at our life and our choices and we say, how did I end up here? How is it I am now far from the Lord and my marriage is a wreck and my home is falling apart? Well, look at the people you listen to. Like, it's no question. The older generation sees it clear, plain as day. It's obvious if you listen to the wrong voices and you let them lead your life. It's obvious where that's going to take you. And so when you have a generation that pulls apart from the other, you're going to have a younger generation that's not prepared with God's wisdom to make some serious choices in their life. But I think, as Steve was making before, the point is that you have an older generation that lacks hope. I think one of the greatest blessings, or maybe one of the greatest teachers, if you will, it can be a blessing. This is a blessing. Congregations like Kleinwood, where we are up in Dallas, Kimball Road, it's congregations of several hundred. Those are blessings. But have you all worshiped at a church lately that didn't have any babies crying? In fact, there hadn't been a baby that cried inside that assembly in over a decade. Have you worshiped in a congregation lately that had no brown hair among it? All were gray and were older. Have you worshiped in congregations to where the men had to get up and to lead? Every single man that were there because there weren't enough men to pass and share it along. What happens when the men who are given by Christ's gift to the church, the pastors and the prophets, for us, the shepherds and teachers and evangelists, when there aren't souls to equip anymore? Well, you got generations who are older who get discouraged and jaded and lose sight of hope. because something happened along the way. And instead of having a legacy, now it seems like we have but the end of a local work, and doors are going to have to be closed. Here's what it looks like, and I think this is what I'm hoping to put on the board. It's not one party's responsibility. It's not the responsibility of an older generation, and it's not the responsibility of the younger generation. In many ways, it is exactly illustrated through the relay race. That looks really easy to do if you've never done it before. You look at that and you look at the picture and say, I could do that. I could run a relay race. It's actually a lot harder than you think. It takes a whole lot of coordination, and a lot can go very wrong very quickly if you're not prepared for what's taking place. So think of this. It takes one generation handing with confidence, with certainty, with clarity, and it takes another generation receiving, ready to grab on, ready to take it with confidence, with strength. But any party, if they on their own decide to not take this responsibility seriously, and so maybe we're not really teaching and involved in the lives of the younger people as we ought to be, or I'm not really listening to them today, I'm kind of too caught up in my own life, then something will get lost and dropped along the way. And there are too many stories and pictures of people in churches, and that has been their story. But when it succeeds, there's nothing like it. There is nothing truly like a real godly legacy in the home, in our churches, when you have a generation that is preparing and a generation being prepared. There's such confidence in the Lord and His work and what is taking place when this succeeds. And that's what we want. That's what we're striving for. So we're going to end right here. We got to get, what do we do to go forward? I want to give you just a few things, and we're going to give us a little break before our exercise. We've got an exercise we're going to do in our next lesson. What do we do? What do we do to take some steps, at least the first initial steps, if we're going to try and prevent something like this from happening, or at least from getting worse? First of all, we got to release pride. Pride is at the heart of all of this. From a generation that doesn't care about the other, pride is at the heart of what is keeping us from one another. And the mindset of the youth, it sounds like this: I don't need you. I don't need your wisdom. I don't need your advice. I don't need your example. I don't need your lecture. I don't need your sermon. I got it. I got it. I don't need you. Wisdom says we do. Wisdom says that we do need one another. Wisdom says that on our own, we're going to fail. Wisdom says that on our own, there's often things we don't see about ourselves, about our lives, about our choices. The sad commentary of my generation is we want to be a Moses without being a Joshua. We want to be a teacher without being a student. We want responsibilities, and we want a voice and a seat at the table without living a life that has earned it. And yet that comes from one place. And that comes from a life that has been taught, trained, and measured. Listen, brothers, some of you have just went through this. The whole God-given qualifications of deacons and elders is this: you're not choosing novices. You're choosing men who proved it. They proved it in their lives. They proved it in their families. They're tested. Those are the men you're choosing. Well, young men, I'm not going to be tested. I'm not going to be chosen. I'm not going to be prepared if I'm not listening. Pride keeps us from that. Pride in the voice of the older sounds like this: I don't want to let go. I don't want to. I'm still useful. I still have more to give and more to gain, and I'm not ready to let any of this go. Because in every generational shift, the attention oftentimes today goes to youth. And when we call someone, we want them there. We want our youth, all that excitement and passion. And so the youth get the praise, and the youth get the posters, and the youth get the phone calls. And if we're not careful, King Saul's mentality can creep into our hearts really easy when we begin to become discouraged and suspicious and judgmental and jealous of a younger generation. Their success is not your failure. Their success ought to be your victory when we realize that every generation that has come on behind is there because of a generation before it. Don't look back at the glory days thinking that whatever is can't compare. Release pride and let that go. And secondly, I would say, resist unfair judgment, because it happens on both sides. And it's given on both sides, one to another. I'll say this as one who is a millennial. This made me laugh this week about a farm baseball team that had a millennials night, and the millennials were outraged because the Montgomery Biscuits were offering a night of avocado burgers, selfie stations, napping areas, and participation ribbons for the millennials who wanted to come out. You gotta laugh. That's just good. Because on the other side of things, all we have to do is show text message change from the boomers, like this one, whose mom was texting him saying, please stop changing the Google logo so much. I like the original one. He said, Mom, I don't change the logo. Google changes it. She says, on my computer, you don't run the Google. And he says, if I did, I wouldn't be driving a 2004 Ford. You got to give it. Now, here's what that means. On the standpoint of those who are older to the younger, and the judgment, the unfair judgment, it's not fair to judge a younger generation by a standard I didn't hold myself up to. I think sometimes we look back on where we were based on where we are today, and that's not fair. Because I'll tell you, when I was in my teens and my 20s, I didn't have it all down. I didn't have perfect knowledge. I didn't say things in a way that always made an older generation comfortable. I didn't always dress in ways that I knew they always approved. I didn't always act in ways that they wanted me to act. I needed time, and I needed grace, and I needed an older generation to help me and teach me. And so if I needed that along the way, then so does a younger generation. So don't judge a younger generation on not being there today when we weren't there, in all honesty, when we were younger. From the side of those who are younger to those who are older, my brothers, if you are 40 and younger, 50 and younger, maybe in that greater category, it's not fair of us to judge an older generation on things that they have done because we weren't there. My grandfather, David and I were talking about this in the car. My grandfather was 15 years old when he was taken from the middle of nowhere, Indiana, Coal City, Indiana, and shipped on a plane out to Europe. With a gun held to his chest, he had to go and fight in the Second World War. And I could judge him. I could judge every decision he made, an action that he made. But at the end of the day, that wasn't my war. I didn't have to make those choices. It's not fair of me to judge him and whatever decisions he made or didn't make, because I didn't have to. And spoiler, I am thankful for every decision he made. Here's what that means for us. Can we just make that real? I think the one conflict that we just can't get over, we talk about over and over and over again, unfairly, was the division that took place over the institutional issues in the 50s and the 60s. It's not fair of us to judge those brothers and to say all they wanted to do was to fight. All they wanted to do was to fight and complain and to draw these lines. They didn't do things perfectly. I get that. And they know that. But here's the thing. We weren't there. That wasn't ours. And I can only imagine if that happened today and that setting took place today, based on how wonderfully we handle Facebook arguments today, I can only imagine what would happen of divisions among people today. Because I'll tell you this, the brothers that I know, the men who mentored my heroes, my father and his generations, no, they didn't do things perfectly, but they were good men, godly men. And they stood for things that they felt mattered. So if we're going to have any hope of going forward, let's drop the unfair judgment. It's not fair to judge one generation over another. I'll tell you this, when I reach my 70s and 80s, I sure hope the younger generation is not going to look with a laser focus, with a microscope at every decision of what I do, because there's going to be a lot of mistakes they're going to see. But at the same point, I hope I don't forget what it was like to be a teenager and to judge unfairly that young generation. We have to put that aside. We have to, as Jesus said, give the judgment we would want to receive. And then I would say lastly is to reach out to listen. Some of you said that so well. What would be so different if instead of the judgment and instead of the circles we keep so close with one another, if we sat at a table and just asked to listen? Why is it you feel the way that you feel? Why is it that these things are important to you? Where are you coming from? And how is it we can try with all of our ability in Romans 15 verse 5 to try and be one mind, one voice, one people of God, one group of men of God who are striving to serve our one God with one voice. There's hope. There is great hope, but it's going to come from people who desire to seek peace and to seek to do what is right in our generation. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back in for an exercise. So y'all take about a 10-minute break. So 7:13. Come in about 7:23, and we'll